to Francesco Rizzuto, Dean and Head of the School of Law at Liverpool Hope University. Francesco, welcome to the program. I know obviously investigations are happening in Greece, but migrants have rights, refugees have rights. Would the Pakistani government have the right to take out a case if there's found to be negligence by any kind of security, Coast Guard patrol that was in those waters?
Well, they would, but where? In a Greek court? There might be challenges there. The International Court of Justice, it's difficult to see where that could actually happen. The relatives could possibly, or the government of Pakistan on behalf of some of the relatives, could try and bring an action in Greek courts, or they could bring an action in Pakistani courts, and then you'd have to get the Pakistani courts to convict, and then, of course, you have to try and get whatever compensation you could from the Greeks. Look, this is a terrible, terrible tragedy. I think it's ironic, really, that over the last 3 or 4 days, the media has been dominated by the tragic loss of 5 tourists who were actually very wealthy, who appear to have been lost in the South Atlantic looking for a liner that sank nearly 100 years ago. We have used the most sophisticated means at our disposal, the American Navy and so on, to try and find these people. These poor hundreds of people who disappeared, and many others will continue to disappear, made the headlines, for 2 or 3 days? The BBC had a good story, I think, yesterday, demonstrating that the Greek authorities were probably telling us 1 or 2 untruths as to what really happened in terms of their intervention. But that's disappeared. So I think it's a terrible, terrible contrast in the way the media, not all of the media, of course, deals with these terrible events. It's almost what the French call the banalisation. It's the normalization of hundreds of people drowning, whereas it's big news when 5 rich explorers who want to see a wreck get lost. So there's a problem with evaluation and weights and measures here. But quite clearly, the people who are lost and the Pakistani authorities and Pakistani relatives, presumably it would take the Pakistani government to act on behalf of these people to try and get compensation, but then you have to identify who they are and so on, because quite clearly the relatives of the migrants, and by the way, I don't call them illegal. Irregular is a better term, because then we fall into the trap of legally categorizing people, which I don't think is quite appropriate here. But anyway, so there are challenges there. I'm sorry if I'm a bit long-winded, but I think it's worth saying these things.
It's always worth listening to what you have to say, Francesco. And by the way, at TRT World, we say undocumented migrants, Francesco, because we don't believe that any human being is illegal in any way at all.
Exactly.
Why hasn't action been taken against Greece, which has been found to be guilty on multiple occasions of breaking international law and illegally pushing migrants back at sea? And the EU knows it.
Except the EU has limited powers to actually do anything against Greece. Look, the story is that the Greeks tried to intervene, but the Greek Coast Guard tried to intervene, but these people said, no, we want to continue to Italy. Whether it's true or not, but you could understand the logic of not wanting to end up in Greece, because we know for a fact, and actually there have been cases brought against Greece, for the treatment of migrants. So you can understand that. But the EU is limited in terms of what it can do against Greece, just as it was limited in terms of what it could do against Poland or against Hungary and their treatment of undocumented migrants, if you recall, so-called European solidarity that didn't work. So I think that other than, the UN is going to investigate. It's called for an investigation. I'm sure the EU will try and deal with it. What's interesting is, by the way, that van der Leyen, the president of the Commission, who was interviewed on this and said, yes, it's terrible, but she talked about the agreement with Tunisia as opposed to the Greek problem and actually dealing with that failed state, and it is a failed state, called Libya. And then, of course, the links from Egypt to Libya. So it's extremely difficult to deal with this because, of course, states hide behind this. Well, the states that function, of course, hide behind this notion of sovereignty when it comes to dealing with migration or immigration. So it's extremely difficult. Moral condemnation, of course, pointing the finger, and then possibly liability and damages, but that's a long way away. So unfortunately, this is one of those terrible events where there are victims and there are moral culpables, if you like. But will there be any remedy, any restitution? No, I doubt it very much.
Francesco Rizzuto, thank you so much indeed.
Pleasure.